Just a quick note, we recorded this podcast on Thursday morning before both Congressmen Dan Kildee and George Santos announced their retirements from their highly competitive districts. That's why we don't discuss them in our segment about House open seats, but we will, of course, touch on those races in a later podcast episode.
Welcome to episode 10 of the Inside Elections podcast, where we analyze elections in a nonpartisan, data-driven, and accessible way. In this episode, we'll talk about the fight for the Senate now that Joe Manchin isn't running. We'll talk about the exodus in the House as members announce their exits at an alarming rate. And who will be the next candidate to drop out of the Republican presidential race. Here we go.
Hello, I'm Jacob Rubashkin. I'm a reporter and analyst for Inside Elections, and I'll be spending Thanksgiving in New Jersey's 11th district, which is represented by Democrat Mikey Sherrill.
I'm Erin Covey. I am also a reporter and analyst for Inside Elections, and I'll be spending Thanksgiving in Texas's 31st district, which is represented by John Carter, and then also Texas's 20th district, which is represented by Joaquin Castro.
And I'm Nathan Gonzales, editor of Inside Elections, and I will not be spending Thanksgiving in any congressional district because I will be here in the District of Columbia, which has no representation in Congress. Still, I'm not sure. Maybe Republicans are working on that in the House right now, but I'm skeptical. But what is your favorite? The obligatory question is, what is your favorite Thanksgiving food or dish?
What is a food but not a dish?
I don't know. I feel like dish felt very Midwest, so I was running into food. Yeah, take it wherever you want to go.
I mean, I like all of it. The turkey's the least exciting part, but I'm a sides person. I like pies, pumpkin, apple, pecan. There's not really a Thanksgiving dish that I don't like unless the turkey's bad.
Yeah, I am a fan of the whole thing together as well. I think that we do a sweet potatoes and then kind of topped with marshmallows that get, a little burnt in the oven, and that's always really tasty. And then one of the most fun things is kind of after we have our big kind of meal, which we do in the middle of the day. In the evening, we take all of the turkey carcass and we make a turkey stock, and we have turkey soup for dinner that night. So that's always fun as well. And the house smells great, and it's a nice kind of coda to the whole event.
I can't do sweet potatoes for some reason. Even if you put all the marshmallows on, I don't know. I have a mental block, but I'm also a sides. I the sides, mashed potatoes. Give me mashed potatoes and gravy. My wife does this, stuffing. It's not actually in the turkey, but stuffing, but then has dried cranberries and fresh apples chopped up in it. And I'll take that. I'll take that. I'll take that any day. So I guess I'm preparing myself to probably eat too much, but I think that's what you have to do, right?
It's a responsibility as Americans, Nathan.
What the Pilgrims would have wanted. So before we get to our big topics, let's do a few headlines because a lot has happened since our last episode. Jacob, why don't you kick us off?
So in Virginia, Democrats maintain control of the state Senate. Very narrow control, but still holding that chamber. And they actually flipped control of the state House of Delegates, despite Republican efforts to win back the Senate and hold the state House, which they had heading into these elections. It was a good night for Democrats who were working to prevent Glenn Youngkin, the Republican governor, from establishing full control over the Commonwealth from the top down. It could have been even better for Democrats. There were actually a number of races that Republicans won very narrowly, closer races than any of Democrats' victories in the House of Delegates. So, obviously a good result for Democrats. They could have won probably another 4 seats without too much more effort. The upshot here is that Republicans won't be able to pass their 15-week abortion ban, which is something they talked a lot about on the campaign trail. And Glenn Youngkin will probably not have to run for president now that he wasn't able to win the important elections in his own state. In New Jersey, also state legislative elections, Democrats held both chambers there, actually picked up some seats in the state assembly. So not a great night for Republicans at the local level, at least on the East Coast.
And we'll talk about some of the other races as well, but I think there's a tendency to maybe dismiss, well, these were state legislative elections, but there were definitely some important messages or lessons that are coming out of those that are going to impact 2024. But Erin, what should folks not miss?
Yeah, so continuing along that train of thought, Ohio voters voted to both codify abortion rights and also legalize marijuana. Obviously, neither of these are partisan races, and so it's not one of these races that we were rating and maybe following as closely. But it's really important for 2024 because it kind of affirms Democrats' messaging, particularly on the issue of abortion, and that remains an effective message, even in a state as red as Ohio. And Sherrod Brown, who is one of the most vulnerable senators up for reelection next year, is certainly going to be taking some cues, I think, from places where these issues did really well, but maybe Trump won them or Vance won them in 2022. And so this is really going to provide a bit of a path to victory for him, I think, in 2024.
Yeah, we'll see if whether Ohio turns into H Street, close to where I live, which is just a whole row of smoke shops after smoke
One
shop.
can only hope.
Yeah, it is.
They need
It
a
is astounding.
personality.
I'm amazed that the market can uphold the amount of smoke shops we have in our neighborhood. But also in 2023, Kentucky Democratic Governor Andy Beshear won re-election over Republican State Attorney General Daniel Cameron. Beshear won with 52.5%, which is a landslide for a Democrat in Kentucky. A lot of the same lessons, even in a red state like Kentucky. Democrats used access to abortion as one of their key points against Cameron, that he held a too restrictive view on that issue. And so, yeah, Democrats had a good night. The Inside Elections podcast is sponsored by George Washington University's Graduate School of Political Management, or GSPM. The GSPM program offers master's degrees in legislative affairs and political management with in-person and online class schedules designed for the working professional. I was thinking back to my days in the GSPM program and how some of my fellow students use the program as a break from Capitol Hill or a break from the campaign trail. And then when I was, I was watching the news recently where people are getting into fist fights or threatening to get into fist fights, or they're in the minority, and thinking about considering a graduate school program might be an opportunity to escape some things. It's still work, but it might be an opportunity for a new chapter or a fresh chapter for some of you out there. So click on the link and check out what the GSPM program has to offer. First up, the fight for the U.S. Senate in the wake of Joe Manchin's decision not to run for re-election.
After months of deliberation and long conversation with my family, I believe in my heart of hearts that I have accomplished what I set out to do for West Virginia. I have made one of the toughest decisions of my life and decided that I will not be running for re-election to the United States Senate. But what I will be doing is traveling the country and speaking out to see if there is an interest in creating a movement to mobilize the middle and bring Americans together.
So that was West Virginia Senator Joe Manchin announcing that he would not seek re-election in what would have been his most difficult and competitive campaign yet. Manchin has served in elected office in West Virginia for about 4 decades now, and was the last remaining Democrat in the state to hold statewide office. What once had been a solidly Democratic state has shifted considerably toward Republicans, is now one of the most Republican states in the country. So he was always going to be an underdog, even if he did run for re-election for the Senate. But by announcing his retirement, not contesting that seat, either as a Democrat or as an independent, he effectively cedes control of the West Virginia Senate seat to the Republicans, and that affects the Senate majority math across the map by taking a race that we had seen on the battlefield and moving it into the solid Republican column.
And so walk through the math. Let's walk through the math a little bit more. That if let's consider West Virginia again, that if everything else stays the same, if each party wins all of their races and Republicans win the presidential race, then they still control the Senate because because the vice president could break tie votes. But if President Biden is reelected, then Republicans need to gain one more seat. They need to get one more. So what are the prospects for Republicans, and how does it change how we're evaluating those races?
Well, Republicans have a number of opportunities across the country to flip Senate seats. This is a very vulnerable cycle for Democrats. The top two at this point are Montana and Ohio, Senators John Tester and Sherrod Brown, both running in states that voted for Donald Trump in the last presidential election, will likely vote for the Republican nominee in the next presidential election. They will both have to outrun the top of the ticket by a considerable margin if they want to hold on to their seats. So Republicans are kind of laser focused on those two seats as by far the easiest path to the majority. But there are a half dozen other seats that Democrats are defending that are in pretty marginal states. And depending on how close the presidential election is, a lot of those incumbents, like Bob Casey in Pennsylvania, Jackie Rosen in Nevada, Tammy Baldwin in Wisconsin, could find themselves in highly competitive, very close races, as well as that open seat in Michigan, where Senator Debbie Stabenow is retiring. All places that on a good night for Republicans could easily swing the other way.
And this puts pressure on losing West Virginia, puts pressure on Democrats to try to come up with offensive opportunities or cultivate offensive opportunities to compensate for losses. So, Erin, you've been covering Texas and Florida. What are the real prospects for Democrats to? They would argue they're already on the battlefield. We have one on, one off. But what are Democrats' real prospects in those races right now?
Yeah, I think Democrats' prospects in Texas are slightly better than they are in Florida, but I think they're both races are on the edge of the battlefield, and they could be competitive under the right circumstances. But a lot of that depends on how the presidential race plays out in these states. And you have Texas, which has become kind of slightly more Democratic with each presidential cycle over the past decade or so. And so, if Trump wins Texas by just maybe 3 or 4 points. He won it by 5 points last time. I don't think that would be a huge surprise, and that wouldn't be that'll be difficult for a Democratic Senate nominee, probably Colin Allred, to overcome, but it's doable. And then in Florida, you kind of have a reverse situation where Trump, the presidential race was closer in Florida than it was in Texas in 2020, but the state as a whole has been moving much more Republican pretty rapidly in recent years. Now, it's a little difficult to judge because I think 2022 was such a good cycle for Florida Republicans that maybe some Democrats or some Republicans are underestimating the fact that it could be potentially competitive again. And I think we've seen that like the Biden campaign seems to still see Florida as a part of the presidential battleground in a way that Texas is not. So, that could potentially bode well for Democrats in the Florida Senate race. But, even though Ted Cruz and Rick Scott, I should mention who these two people are who are up for reelection, they're both polarizing figures, have had some really close races, but they're also going to be very well defended going into 2024, I think. When Cruz was on the ballot in 2018, it took Republicans a while to kind of see how competitive this race was. Whereas I think this cycle, Republicans are much more concerned about making sure Cruz is defended. So, could develop into more competitive races. We'll see what happens. Texas looks slightly better right now, but it's kind of marginal. So either one of them could be potentially on the battlefield next year.
I was amused when Senator Scott tweeted a cartoon about, it was a graveyard with the candidates that he has defeated in the past because he was governor for 2 terms previously before he was elected to the Senate. The names of people he has defeated on these tombstones. And he has consistently won his races by less, I believe, two of them by less than 1%. One of them maybe slightly more than 1 point. I mean, we're not talking about landslides. But one of the challenges for Democrats, along with what you laid out, Erin, is the expense, right? Texas and Florida are two of the
Yeah.
most expensive places to run races because you have multiple expensive media markets in both areas. So one of the narratives coming out of the Manchin announcement was that Democrats were going to be able to save some money because both parties protect their incumbents at all costs almost. But how much money do we think they really would have spent in West Virginia that could be transferred to other races?
So I went back and I looked at how much money they spent in West Virginia in 2018, they being kind of outside Democratic groups, people like the DSCC and the Senate Majority PAC. And what I found was that it was about $18 million that got spent on Joe Manchin's behalf in 2018. He obviously won that election narrowly. I don't think that they would have necessarily spent that kind of money this time around. I mean, Nathan, you mentioned the protected incumbents above all else. I think Doug Jones in Alabama might have something to say about that. He was running in a very difficult race in 2020 and got no outside help really, or perhaps very very marginal. But everyone kind of understood that race was not one worth putting money into. I think Manchin they would have treated a little bit differently for a number of reasons, but um, I think I'm not sure that those dollars would necessarily be going to Florida and Texas, again, because of the incumbency mandate that those groups have. I think it's probably more likely that they would have gone to Ohio and Montana, where there are incumbents who are fighting for reelection. But I do think there's some credence to the notion that it does free up some money that would have otherwise gone to West Virginia, and it certainly clarifies the outline of the battlefield in a way that allows Democrats, both in DC, but also donors and activists out in the states, to refocus and be more efficient in their efforts. But I do think the Biden element is interesting, especially in Florida. I think whether or not Florida is competitive is probably much more dependent on whether the Biden campaign invests there than Texas. Because I think Colin Allred is going to raise the money to make Texas competitive. We saw Beto raise what then was kind of the most money of any Senate campaign ever in 2018, running against Ted Cruz. I think Colin Allred can raise that kind of money. I'm not sure that Debbie Mucarsel Powell can raise the kind of money she would need to make Florida competitive on her own.
Yeah, and Allred's already outpacing where Beto was at this point in 2018. So again, it's been 6 years and Senate races become increasingly more expensive with every cycle. But I think Allred definitely has the ability to do that. And on the flip side, I'm curious with the money situation, Republicans might save money in West Virginia too, because they're not going to have to potentially spend to get Jim Justice through a primary that could have determined how competitive the general election was, right?
Right, and Manchin was bringing $10+ million, I think, cash on hand
Yeah.
to the table as well. So you're right that it's not just a net money gain for in reallocation of resources for Democrats, that Republicans should not have to spend as much time or energy taking over this seat. I think NRSC Chairman Steve Daines said we like our odds in Montana, or sorry, in West Virginia. He's from Montana. We like our odds in West Virginia, which is a very understated way to look at the race. But and this money game is not. There is a competition between incumbents, right? And that's one of the reasons why in New Jersey, which is not an open seat, where Senator Bob Menendez is both under indictment and planning to run for re-election, but he has a new challenger in First Lady Tammy Murphy, who just announced her campaign. Here's a clip from her introductory campaign video.
I am so proud of everything we've accomplished, but I know there's a lot more to do. And that's why I'm announcing this. I'm running for the United States Senate because we owe it to our kids to do better.
So that was Tammy Murphy. There is already a challenger to Menendez in the primary with Congressman Andy Kim. So Jacob, what do we think this does to the primary? Does it help Menendez at all? And what do we think Andy Kim is going to do with this Murphy candidacy?
I don't think it helps Menendez at all. I think Menendez is, I said in one of my stories, I think he's in Dallas Cowboys territory in terms of his popularity in New Jersey. He consistently polls in the single digits in this primary. His approval rating among Democrats is in the single digits at the moment. It doesn't matter. One opponent, two opponents, maybe three opponents, because I think there is at least one other person who's going to get into this race. Maybe if you had 10 opponents to Bob Menendez, you could see him finding a way to sneak through with 12 or 13%, but I don't think that's going to happen. I think that Tammy Murphy is a very credible candidate. She brings a lot to the table in terms of her institutional backing, obviously very involved in the state's politics for some time. We've seen her already begin to line up some of those very important county endorsements, right? In New Jersey, it actually does matter. There's a tangible benefit to being endorsed by a county party. You get a preferential placement on the ballot in that county. And so the fact that she's been able to lock down support from county leaders, especially in North Jersey, Hudson County, Somerset County, that goes a long way for her. I did think it was interesting. She said in an interview that she was not planning on self-funding her race. Her and her husband, Governor Phil Murphy, very wealthy, former Goldman Sachs bankers. They own a soccer team in New Jersey. Phil Murphy did self-fund his first run for governor, but she said she has no intention of putting in her own money. I think that it certainly complicates Andy Kim's path. He looked like he was going to romp against Menendez if it was just the two of them in a primary. Now he's got a real credible opponent. I think that the other candidate who I think is in the mix is a woman named Patricia Campos Medina, who is a labor leader in the state. She currently heads up the Worker Institute at the School of Industrial and Labor Relations at my alma mater, Cornell. And she is seriously considering a bid. I think I wouldn't be surprised to see her get into that race at some point soon. She's not a known figure the way that either Murphy or Kim are. So whether she can raise money and start to put together some support will go a long way in determining whether this becomes a 4-person race or stays the 3-person race that it looks like right now.
And what are the chances? I'm looking. I believe the filing deadline is in early April for New Jersey. What are the chances that Kim ultimately decides to run for re-election?
I mean, I don't know. I guess he could do it, but right now he's ahead in polling. He's raising a ton of money. I think that there's some latent frustration at him for announcing his bid so early, especially before the New Jersey legislative elections, before the Virginia legislative elections too. But the New Jersey legislative elections were concluded. I think that there's always kind of a tension between candidates who announce their bids for higher office when the local folks are still trying to raise money and get out the vote for their own races. I think the circumstances of the primary would have to shift considerably for Andy Kim to feel like he couldn't win and had to drop back down to his House seat.
Well, Manchin's announcement was not the only retirement announcement last week. Actually, the same day that he announced that he wasn't running, 3 House members announced that they weren't returning to Congress. One of them is Brad Winstrup, a Republican from Ohio. Here's a clip of his video making that decision.
Sadly, all too often, the frantic pace of Washington has kept me away from our home. I'm ready to change that. So I want you to hear it from me first. I'll be retiring from Congress at the end of next year. I'm just a fortunate guy who's been blessed with a wonderful wife and 2 loving children under the age of 11. I'm blessed with good health, and I look forward to fighting for truth, justice, and the American way in whatever I do in the future.
The holiday season is here, which also means it is retirement announcement season in Congress. We had 3 House retirements back-to-back last Thursday after Manchin announced that he wasn't running for re-election either. The list includes Brad Winstrup, who you just heard, Derek Kilmer, and Brian Higgins. And then a couple days later, Texas Rep. Michael Burgess also announced that he was not running for reelection. So did Pat Fallon, but then Fallon changed his mind a couple days later and is now actually running for reelection. So we've had 4 House retirements in the past week. There were several the week before. And I think before we've made this point that it seemed like there were fewer open seats this cycle. I think we're still under the average number of open seats, but there is still a lot of time before these filing deadlines approach and more members could choose to head for the exits.
So when I read through the Fallon saga, it sounded like he said, "I want to leave to spend more time with my family," and then it sounded like his family was like, "Actually, why don't you run again?"
Well, he wasn't actually. Well, I guess
you're good. Well, or he was going to run for the legislature, the state
Right.
legislature, in order to be closer to his family. But it sounded like his family was still encouraging him to return to Congress. So I don't.
Yeah,
I got a kick out of that.
that's
So
funny.
were there any, except for the surprise about him, Fallon announcing not running and then running, were there any surprises in this batch to either of you?
I think Kilmer's retirement was the only real surprise, just from talking to folks in the region. I don't think anyone saw this coming. He's relatively young. He's 49 years old. He's been involved in a lot of work to kind of modernize and restructure Congress. So like a lot of institutional kind of work that I think made folks surprised that he was heading for the exits this early. He has been around for around a decade or so.
But he's still
And
young.
so,
He's not.
but yeah,
one of
he's
these.
young. As
Okay.
opposed to like Higgins, Winstrup, Burgess, they're all in their 60s and 70s, which is about the median age in Congress these days, but on the older side. So it makes sense that these are folks who are, when they say they're retiring, they might actually be retiring and taking some time off work. Whereas Kilmer, could have a whole nother career ahead of him. So yeah, I think Kilmer's was probably the only surprise. But, I'm anticipating there are still quite a few other members who are kind of still on retirement watch right now because of their age or other reasons who could announce in the coming weeks.
Higgins did surprise me, I think, especially because he's leaving early. He is
Oh,
going to
right.
resign in February to take a job as the president of the Shea Performing Arts Center in Buffalo, where he's from. I think that uh, it's an indicator of how much or how little members like being in the House right now that we're seeing a number of these retirements, especially when it comes to resignations. He could have waited the extra couple months to finish out his term and then take a new job, but I think clearly he wants to leave now. Well, not now, but in February. I did look up. He'll be getting a pay increase, which I'm sure is meaningful to him. I pulled up the Shea Performing Arts Center's 990s, and they make a little bit more than your average congressman. But I think that it, we see this a lot. Members in the minority head for the exits early. And what I find interesting about a lot of these retirements is that it's not just that this time. It's also members of the majority who are headed out, perhaps not necessarily at the tail end of their career. Thinking about like Debbie Lesko, who we've already talked about before, who is retiring at the end of this term. Ken Buck, I know, is a little older, but still hasn't been in Congress all that long. I think it's, Pat Fallon, who very nearly ran for the Texas State Senate rather than come back to Congress. I mean, he's been there since, 2018. I think he's a very recent member.
Yeah.
I think it's clear that people don't like being there right now. I mean, there are fist fights in the hallways and
Kidney punches or not kidney punches. I mean, this is brutal.
Kidney punches. I saw Mark Wayne Mullen tossed Tim Burchett out of his workout group. It's really
Funny coming from Mark Wayne Mullen. He literally just tried to threaten someone to a fight.
Yeah, I think it was because, if Burchett had actually, gone up and hit McCarthy, maybe he would have been allowed back in the group. But I just think there's something to Congress being a miserable place right now that I wouldn't be surprised if we see a number more of retirements coming out of Thanksgiving and the winter break.
Right. And I think one of the things to watch is the timing. I mean, we just had a flurry of kind of Texas activity. Kay Granger, Republican, longtime Republican Congresswoman, announced a couple weeks ago that she wasn't running, and now Texas. And it's part of the reason is because the Texas filing deadline is coming up in mid-December. So I
Right.
pulled up, thanks to, I'm looking off the Daily Coast Elections spreadsheet, which is very helpful. California is in December as well. Ohio. Then in early January, Kentucky, we already had an announcement that a longtime Congressman Hal Rogers, the Republican, is announcing he's running for, I think it's a 23rd term. And so that one of the reasons why we're seeing that the timing is not just part of it's because of holidays and spending time with family, but it's also when do they have to make a decision about whether they're running or not. So those are some
Yeah.
states to watch in the coming weeks.
Do y'all think McCarthy's going to run for reelection?
I don't know. Long
Speaking of
pauses aren't great
California.
on podcasts. I'm gonna say I don't have any insider intelligence on this one. I'm gonna say that he's gonna run again, but
Yeah, I think that he probably still wants to be speaker. I am my the situation I'm most curious about is like if Republicans have a good night in the House next year and they put together a bigger majority than the one they have now, does McCarthy try and make a comeback? What is Mike Johnson's position in the party come next year? Is he still speaker? Is he kind of the consensus leader of the party, or is there an opportunity for a McCarthy type figure if that kind of troublemaking 8-member contingent is either not as strong or because they aren't there, as many of them, or there are just more votes to spare? Does McCarthy try and make a move to come back to power? And I don't know. I'd also, we should mention Abigail Spanberger too, the Democrat from Virginia, also not running for reelection next year to focus on a campaign for governor. So,
Which was not a surprise.
yeah, she
That was
was
reported a couple
definitely
months ago.
she was telegraphing that. Before we move on, how many of these retirement announcements do we think impact the fight for the majority, or they are taking place in competitive districts?
I don't think any of them will impact the fight for the majority, at least any of the recent ones. The only two really competitive open seats we have so far are Michigan's 7th district, which is held by Alyssa Slotkin, who's running for Senate, and California's 47th district, which is held by Katie Porter, who is also running for Senate. And those are really the only two that are kind of battleground House seats. There's a couple of these districts that are kind of on the border between like maybe solid and likely that if there is a shift in the national environment could become competitive under the right circumstances. But for now, these are mostly going to be races to watch where you're going to want to focus on the primary battles.
Right, because the primary will effectively be choosing the next member of Congress. And the
Right.
Spanberger seat is sort of in between. It could be competitive, right? I mean,
That's
it's
true.
it's
Yeah.
between. It's not as competitive as those toss-up races that you mentioned, but also it's not solid for Democrats, and Democrats are going to have to go through a primary there. But let's move on. And finally, let's chat about the presidential race, because in our last episode, both of you foreshadowed Senator Tim Scott's exit from the race. So I feel like I owe it to our listeners to ask you who's going to drop out next.
Asa Hutchinson.
Yeah, it's got to be Hutchinson.
Burgum? Is Burgum still running? Is he still in the race? The governor of North Dakota?
Yeah, he's still kicking.
He still has more money to spend, though, like that he can't spend. I think Hutchinson's in a more immediately kind of dire position. But yeah, who knows? I don't think, DeSantis and Haley certainly aren't dropping out anytime like soon. I don't think Ramaswamy is either, but, or Christie. I'm not really sure where his head's at all.
I think all of them have kind of reasons not to. Ramaswamy has a lot of money and he clearly relishes the attention and the ability
Right.
to get up on stage and berate all of these people to his heart's desire. Chris Christie is running a really lean campaign. I mean, he's not really spending any money. He is relying mostly on earned media. He has a donor base that is at least propped up by, to some degree, Democratic donors who continue to give him money so that he can get on the debate stage. I think he'll stay in past New Hampshire at least. And then, Burgum has money. I wouldn't be surprised if Burgum drops out at some point. I don't know when the North Dakota filing deadline is, Nathan, if you've got that in front of you. But
April 8th.
Okay, so he's got plenty
He's
of
got time.
time to decide if he wants to run for governor again. I don't know. I mean, these guys don't get as rich as they are by spending money on lost causes. So I wouldn't be surprised if Burgum takes a bow at some point, maybe if he doesn't make the next debate. But I think Burgum and Hutchinson kind of are in their own category. And then after that, all these people could stick around for a little while, certainly through New Hampshire.
Yeah. I'm not convinced DeSantis is going to go all the way to Iowa. And I know that he is relatively even with Haley now, but I feel like they're two trains headed in the passing each other, going in different directions. And you asked, I think, Jacob, you asked me last episode, make the case for DeSantis dropping out. And I did not do it artfully at all. But I think it would be to save embarrassment. I mean, if he's just going to get routed by Trump, then I think that would be an incentive to just say, hey, just bow out before that happens. But I've been wrong before, although I have been telling people for months that I was skeptical that Manchin was going to run for re-election, and so that ended up being right every once in a while. And finally, our last segment is Look What I Found, where we talk about anything. It could be politics, but it could be sports, pop culture, anything you want. You never know what you're going to get. So, Erin, what did you find this time?
So I don't think I've mentioned this on the podcast before because I had started reading it like a year ago and then put it back down and haven't really picked it up since. But with all of the news coming out of Congress recently, I thought I would recommend The Field of Blood, which is a book about pre-Civil War Congress and just kind of all of the violent incidents that were becoming increasingly common in that era. It wasn't just the caning of Charles Sumner. But it's a really interesting read. I didn't put it down because I was bored with it. It's because I have a short attention span and I need to get back to it. But yeah, I would recommend it. Maybe not for your children, Nathan. I know you're always looking for bedtime reading, but it's a little dark.
In a weird way, that almost sounds up their alley. Like they love war history, military history, whether it's Civil War, World War II. Like they love it. So it might be too graphic, but it's closer to their lane than what you might think.
Yeah, I think I saw Mark Wayne Mullen carrying a copy of that around the hill when I was up there the other day.
Wait, are you serious?
No.
Oh my God, that's unbelievable. I wouldn't doubt it.
Someone should send him a copy.
Jacob, what did you find?
So this is not something that I found recently, but it's something that I find every week. So I want to give a shout out to the folks at Cucina al Volo at the DuPont Circle Farmers Market. They're an Italian restaurant. They make and sell fresh pasta, and it's always like one of the highlights of my week to figure out what kind of fresh pasta I'm going to buy and then what recipe I'm going to make with it to start my week off. It's a very nice way to start a Monday or Tuesday with some fresh pasta.
Yeah, and I found that I have a Nate Bargatze problem. You might remember that he's a comedian that I mentioned a few episodes ago. I try to listen to the Nate Land podcast. If you think this podcast is too long, that one they usually run 2 hours on theirs. But since that time that I mentioned him, he's been on he hosted Saturday Night Live. If you haven't seen his George Washington sketch, call it up on YouTube. I think it's going to be a classic. But in February, he's coming to DC to the Capital One Arena. I don't have tickets yet. Probably a pretty safe bet that I'm going to end up there. So I don't know. He seems like a good guy, and it's if clean comedy, if that's something you're looking for, that's sort of his lane. But I don't know. Did either of you see the Saturday Night Live? Any of the skits out of that?
I saw the George Washington one. It was funny.
Okay. So it's
No.
not just dad humor. Like it has a broader
It's
a broader
not
appeal.
dad humor. I would argue that dad humor has broad appeal.
There we go. All right, I don't feel too old. That's all the time we have. We discussed the fight for the Senate after Joe Manchin's exit and a slew of House retirements. Thank you for joining us. At Inside Elections, we provide nonpartisan analysis of congressional, presidential, and gubernatorial races. With a combination of reporting and data, we break down the key races and bring valuable context to complex elections. Please go to InsideElections.com to subscribe to the bi-weekly newsletter. We have individual subscriptions as well as group packages that are tailor-made for association or corporate PACs. If you liked today's episode, please do all the things that help us out. Click the thumbs up button on YouTube, leave us a review, leave us a message. If you didn't like today's episode, please email George Santos. We also want to thank our producers, Alan Tazinski and Melissa Lenner of Pretty Easy Podcasts, and our associate producer, Conrad Tolosa. Please come back and join us again next time.